I never thought I'd live to see the day America would be forced to do what no superpower is ever supposed to do, but that day has come. For the first time in decades, Washington has been compelled to offer an unthinkable deal. A desperate plea sent to the very two nations we spent years trying to strangle, Venezuela and China. This isn't sophisticated strategy. This is the signal of an empire running out of breath. The American economy has reached a state I can describe in one word. Thirsty, thirsty for heavy oil so badly that refineries could grind to a halt, thirsty for cash to the point the government has to beg someone, anyone, to buy its bonds just to keep the lights on, and the painful irony is this. The two countries we punish the hardest are now the two countries we need the most. But to grasp how seismic this shock really is, we have to look at the foundations slowly sinking beneath our feet. For 80 years, America rested on two absolute pillars of power, the petrodollar and U.S. treasuries. They were the tools of hegemony that let us spend without limit, sanction anyone we wanted, and still remain the center of the global economy. But do you know what the real irony is? The very instruments that built the empire are now becoming the noose tightening around its neck. The moment Washington froze Russia's sovereign assets in 2022 was the moment global trust in the dollar shattered. The world instantly understood something we had tried to ignore. This currency is not neutral. It is a weapon, and anyone could be next. That wasn't the action of a confident superpower. That was the action of a desperate empire that didn't realize it was destroying the foundation of power it had enjoyed for nearly a century. How exactly did America, by its own hand, maneuver itself into the position of having to beg the very people it once tried to crush? To understand why the Venezuela deal represents Washington's most humiliating U-turn in decades, we have to remember how America treated Caracas. For years, the goal wasn't to negotiate with Nicolas Maduro. It was to topple him. We seized Venezuela's overseas assets, froze their national accounts, embargoed their entire oil industry, the only lifeline their economy had, and even put a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head like he was a Wild West outlaw. Back then, policymakers genuinely believed Venezuela would collapse quickly. Maduro's government would fall, and America would regain control of the world's largest oil reserves. What they never saw coming was the backlash. Think about it. If you're banned, strangled, isolated, and forbidden from selling your oil in dollars, what do? Venezuela did the only thing it could. It turned to the rest of the world. They started selling oil in yuan to China, in rupees to India, and in USD, a digital currency Washington can barely control. These transactions happened quietly for years, and then one day, Venezuela became what I call the world's first real-life laboratory for a non-dollar oil market. A sanctioned nation proved to everyone that the petrodollar order isn't sacred. It only exists until someone dares to break it, but that's only half the story. The other half, the part that forced Washington to reverse course, is sitting right inside America's own refineries. Yes, the U.S. has plenty of oil, but it's light crude. Meanwhile, most refineries along the Gulf Coast, built half a century ago, were designed to process heavy crude. And guess where the heavy crude those refineries need comes from? Venezuela. Without heavy oil, U.S. refineries can't produce enough diesel. And without diesel, the entire American supply chain, from trucks, trains, refrigerated warehouses, agriculture to container shipping, slows down, clogs up, and eventually collapses in a domino effect. All because of one type of oil America doesn't have, but Venezuela has in abundance. When Washington's energy advisors finally realized this, they understood America had no choice left except to do the previously unthinkable. Offer Maduro a soft deal, And that's when the unthinkable deal was born. The U.S. started peeling back layers of sanctions. They issued licenses for Chevron to return to Venezuelan fields. They sent secret delegations to Caracas. They offered debt relief, reopened shipping routes, and even discussed the production increases America wanted Venezuela to deliver. In diplomatic language, this is called constructive dialogue. This isn't diplomacy. Diplomacy is when both sides have options. This isn't a deal. A deal is when both sides have leverage. What's happening is the naked truth of power politics, a superpower de-escalating to survive. And what makes it humiliating isn't that America is shaking hands with Maduro. It's that America is forced to do it because its own economic structure backed it into a corner. While Venezuela, the country Washington once dismissed as a failed state, now holds part of America's energy future in its hands. If the Venezuela story exposes the fragility of America's energy system, the China story exposes something even more dangerous. America can't finance itself anymore. Over the next 12 months, the U.S. government needs to borrow roughly $3 trillion just to keep minimal services running, pay federal workers, fund the military, cover social programs, and keep the lights on in government buildings. But the critical question is who is going to lend America that kind of money. The traditional biggest buyer, Japan, is dumping U.S. bonds to save the yen. You have to understand the context. The yen is at its weakest level in decades. And to defend it, Tokyo has to bring money home. There's no spare cash to keep buying American debt. Europe, they're struggling with recession, energy crisis, high interest rates, and stretched budgets. Nobody in Brussels or Berlin can afford to take on someone else's debt. American banks, they're drowning in unrealized losses from the steepest rate hike cycle in 40 years. Those losses are so large that buying significant new treasuries would blow up their balance sheets. So, who is left with both the money and the scale to absorb a $3 trillion debt issuance? Only one country remains, China, and here lies the excruciating paradox America faces. In public, Washington keeps talking about de-risking from China. They threaten 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. They beef up military deployments across the Indo-Pacific, talk about the risk of war over Taiwan, and label China the #1 strategic threat. That's what they say on camera. Behind closed doors, the conversation is completely different. It's not Washington barking orders at Beijing. It's the U.S. Treasury quietly opening back channels and saying the words no superpower ever wants to say. Please don't sell our bonds. Please buy more to help us out. I know it sounds unbelievable, but this is the reality of power politics. Every nation, even a superpower, has moments when structure forces it to its knees. And right now, the entity holding America's financial fate is China. To grasp how dangerous this is, imagine the following. If China decided to dump even a modest portion of the hundreds of billions in treasuries it holds, it would be like yanking the main cable, anchoring the entire U.S. financial system. That single move would send U.S. interest rates exploding upward. A sudden spike in rates would trigger a cascade. Housing prices collapse, stock markets plunge, consumer borrowing costs skyrocket, and the entire U.S. economy would suffer a shock bigger than any recession in decades. That is the power China wields, not through its military, not through missiles, but through being the last buyer big enough to rescue the American financial system. And for the ultimate historical irony, for years, Washington described China as the rival we must contain, encircle, and curtail influence. Yet today, we cannot fund the federal budget without money from that very rival. America put itself in this position through endless deficit spending and arrogance in weaponizing sanctions. When you use your currency as a weapon for too long, the world eventually figures out how to live without it. And when that happens, you end up begging the people you once threatened. That is the current reality, and the reason the China deal is the hardest pill Washington has had to swallow in decades. A superpower can flex military muscle, slap tariffs on rivals, talk about war and deterrence. But there is one thing a superpower can never afford to do: threaten the person holding the keys to its vault. When you look at the full picture, remember something I've been saying for years studying international relations. Great powers don't collapse because they lose on the battlefield. They collapse when the structure of power turns against them. And that is exactly what is happening to the United States right now. It's not China or Venezuela defeating America. It's the very system America built and abused now biting the pillars of its own power. The first pillar is the petrodollar, the foundation of global finance for half a century. Starting in the 1970s, America secured the legendary deal. Oil, the planet's most critical energy source, would be priced and traded in US dollars. That forced the entire world to hoard dollars, buy US treasuries, and accept America's financial dominance as irreplaceable. But every order lasts only until someone dares to break it, and Venezuela was that someone. By selling oil to China in yuan, to India in rupees, and to private buyers in USD, they proved what many countries suspected but were afraid to test. Oil can be sold without dollars. A sanctioned, strangled nation dismissed as irrelevant became the first real proof that the petrodollar is not a law of nature, it's a political arrangement. Countries can walk away from the moment they have alternatives. From that moment, the first pillar of American power began to crack. The second pillar is U.S. Treasury securities. Once considered the world's safest asset, today China is proving the opposite. It doesn't even need to dump bonds or cause a shock. Simply slowing down or stopping purchases is enough to rattle U.S. financial markets, and the world is watching closely. If China, the country with the largest foreign exchange reserves on Earth, no longer treats treasuries as a safe haven, why should smaller nations keep the faith? You have to understand this. In international politics, countries don't act out of emotion. They're not abandoning the dollar because they hate America. They're abandoning it because it has become a national security risk. When the U.S. froze Russia's assets, it sent a message no country could ignore. Your money isn't yours. We can seize it whenever we want. From that moment on, the question every nation from Brazil to Saudi Arabia started asking was, no longer should I use the dollar, but do I dare let my national security depend on America? And as the answer increasingly tilts toward no, American power leaks out like water from a cracked bucket. Here's the truth: financial power doesn't die in a single day. It dies when trust leaves the system. It dies when nations realize they have options. It dies when the cost of using the dollar becomes higher than the benefit. When people fear a currency more than they need it, your power is over. And as the two financial pillars of American power begin to crack, a new gravitational pull has quietly emerged, not in the form of a military alliance, but in the form of an alternative economic system. I know that in Washington, many people like to portray BRICS as an anti-American bloc, a confrontational coalition built to challenge the U.S.-led order. That is the wrong lens. BRICS was not born to fight America. It was born to hedge against the risk America itself created. In other words, BRICS is becoming the safe harbor for countries that fear the day the U.S. dollar, once the neutral tool of global trade, might be aimed straight at them as a weapon. When you're a nation in the global South, you have to ask yourself, if the United States could freeze Russia's assets overnight, could they do the same to me? BRICS emerged as the answer to that fear. And the fascinating part is this: BRICS' rise has been quiet, non-declamatory, free of threats or anti-Western slogans. It has grown through very practical step-by-step agreements until one day the whole world realized a new system was forming right under their feet. Look at what has already changed in just a few years. First, bilateral trade has exploded. Brazil sells agricultural goods to China in yuan. India buys Russian oil and rupees. The UAE trades with India in dirhams. All these transactions have one thing in common: they never touch the US dollar. Second, the R5 payment system is becoming the new financial infrastructure. R5 standing for ruble, rupee, renminbi, real, and rand is not some distant fantasy. It is being built as a connected network that lets BRICS countries trade with one another without going through SWIFT or American banks. If you want to understand how serious this is, remember that American financial power does not come from printing dollars. It comes from the fact that every global transaction has to pass through systems America controls. R5 was created precisely to solve that problem. Third, BRICS is making the dollar disappear from energy transactions, the very sector America once owned outright. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. Saudi Arabia, for the first time in half a century, accepts oil payments in yuan. Once energy is no longer the exclusive domain of the dollar, the petrodollar has lost its soul. There is no attack on the dollar, no military campaign, no sanctions against the United States, no coordinated effort to crash it. The world doesn't need to fire a single shot to weaken the dollar empire. They only have to do one thing: stop using it. And they are doing exactly that every day, quietly, without announcements, without confrontation, simply choosing the safer path for themselves. That is the point Washington still refuses to accept. America is no longer the obligatory center of global commerce. Countries are proving they can trade, grow, and cooperate without asking Washington's permission or routing everything through American banks. For decades, the United States was accustomed to standing in the middle of international commerce, like a bridge every caravan had to cross. BRICS is building new bridges, and the world is changing lanes. The conclusion is brutally simple: the United States is not being overthrown. The United States is being bypassed. Once global trade flows are route, American economic power does not disappear. It simply ceases to be the center. And in international relations, losing centrality is usually the first step of long-term decline. As BRICS continues to open new lanes for global commerce and America's two financial pillars crack a little more each day, we are entering a phase that in political science I call imperial liquidation, the liquidation phase of empire. This is not a fancy terminology. It precisely describes the process a superpower must go through when the structure of power can no longer support its ambitions. Imperial liquidation happens when an empire is forced to accept deals it once considered humiliating, make concessions to rivals it previously wanted to control, and sign terms it once swore it would never put pen to. It is not a choice, it is survival. And the United States today is right in the middle of that phase. America has to accept Maduro, the man it once used every tool imaginable from sanctions and embargoes to a bounty on his head to overthrow. Yet now Washington has to go back to Caracas and say, "We need your oil." America has to accept China, the country it calls the #1 strategic competitor, the greatest threat to the US-led order. But when you need $3 trillion to keep your own government running, and no one except China can provide that liquidity, you are no longer the one setting terms. America has to accept BRICS, a system that is gradually replacing Washington's central role in global trade and finance. For years, the U.S. treated BRICS as a loose movement incapable of real change. Today, BRICS is not only alive, it is becoming the escape hatch for countries that want to avoid dollar dominance. Most importantly, America has to accept the new rules of the game. Rules it no longer writes, no longer enforces, and sometimes doesn't even have veto power over. That is the clearest sign of imperial liquidation. The empire can no longer sustain the illusion of control. But what is pushing America deeper into this phase are the two final choices Washington faces, and neither is painless. Choice 1, default, if the United States cannot find enough buyers for its bonds. If interest rates spike to levels the system cannot bear, a default would collapse the entire global financial order. The dollar is not just America's currency, it is the backbone of international payments, foreign exchange reserves, and energy trade. A U.S. default would send shock waves through markets that no central bank could contain. From New York to Tokyo, London to Sao Paulo, every economy would suffer the fallout, but the alternative is no less devastating. Choice 2, print money, print more dollars to pay the debt, cover the deficits, avoid default, but that leads to inflation, not the annoying kind, but the kind that dismantles America's middle class. Wages can't keep up with prices. Savings lose value. Housing, healthcare, and education costs keep climbing while real American incomes shrink year after year. And if you want to know what the first visible symptom of imperial liquidation looks like, this is it. An empire that can no longer keep its promises to its own citizens and has to shift the burden onto their shoulders to preserve the old power structure. The fall of a superpower does not happen on the battlefield. It happens on your bills. It lives in the gas price you pay, the mortgage rate you accept, the savings that lose value, the purchasing power that quietly slips away. Empires don't die from military defeat. They die when their own people can no longer afford the cost of maintaining the illusion of greatness, and we are standing right on that threshold. And that brings us to the final part of this story where you need to understand one simple but crucial truth. The world is not against America. The world simply no longer wants to be dependent on America. That distinction matters enormously. This is not a rebellion against the United States. It is a natural reaction to the risk America itself created by turning the dollar, the financial system, and economic tools into weapons. When you weaponize currency, don't be surprised when countries build systems you can't control. And the unthinkable deal Washington just had to sign with Venezuela and China is not the disease. It is only the symptom of a much deeper illness. The world has lost faith in America's power and stability. You may not see it every day, but I assure you the capitals of the world from Riyadh to Brasilia, New Delhi to Abu Dhabi saw the signal long ago. They understand that the era in which America served as the guarantor of the international order is weakening. And in power politics, when a vacuum appears, someone else fills it. This is not the apocalypse. This is a power transition, something that has happened many times in human history. The British Empire faced this moment after World War II. The French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman empires all lived through the minute when they had to accept they were no longer the center of the world. What makes this moment different is that the transition is not happening on battlefields, but inside the global trade, energy, and financial systems. Power does not vanish, it simply moves to wherever there is stability, resources, and trust. And right now, many countries believe the system BRICS is building offers more benefits than the one tied to the dollar and American banks. Political rhetoric cannot change reality. Washington can talk tough, release strategies, announce as many containment campaigns as it wants. But in the real world where decisions are made in quiet diplomatic calls, where oil has to flow and debt has to be financed. Everything comes down to actions, not words. And if you really want to know where America stands in this new era, don't listen to what politicians say on television. Look at who Washington is shaking hands with. They are shaking hands with Maduro, the man they once called a dictator who had to be removed. They are shaking hands with China, the country they label the #1 strategic rival. They are doing it not because they want to, but because they have to. A confident superpower would never sign deals like these, but a superpower losing altitude has to accept deals it once considered humiliating. And that tells you everything. When a nation has to beg the very people it once sanctioned, that is not just a policy shift. It is a change of era. Empires never realize they have lost the throne until they are forced to ask for help from the same people they once tried to strangle. And ladies and gentlemen, America has just crossed that moment. If you found this analysis helpful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next commentaries. Thank you for watching. See you in the next